Julian Vane stood in the dirt, watching his $10 billion empire turn into a dark graveyard of glass, while Hestia Sterling sat in his executive chair, sipping tea from the very porcelain cup he tried to smash. He called her a relic, a ghost in a silk dress. He offered $50 million to buy her legacy. And when she refused, he brought the bulldozers. Julian laughed while her ancestral walls crumbled. He didn't know he was bulldozing his own foundation. As Hestia Sterling slowly turned her Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring, she wasn't feeling revenge. She was feeling pity. Julian forgot to read the ground deeds from 1876. The house he destroyed was the only legal anchor for the city's power grid. By breaking the walls, he broke his own future in the next few minutes. You will witness the surgical destruction of an arrogant titan. This is the sovereign move. Pay attention. Hestia is about to teach you how to win a war. Before the first shot is even fired, the ballroom of the Sterling estate did not just hold people. It held history. The air was thick with the scent of aged mahogany, rare white orchids, and the heavy, metallic smell of unspoken power. Hestia Sterling moved through the crowd like a silent storm. Her mahogany skin was flawless, polished. It reflected the amber glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Her architectural silver bob was a sharp, symmetrical masterpiece that defied the soft curves of the room. She was the only person in the gala wearing custom-tailored, unbranded charcoal silk. In a room full of loud logos, she was the quietest, and therefore the loudest. She reached for a glass of sparkling water. As she did, the light caught her midnight-blue sapphire signet ring. It sat heavy on her pinky finger, cold, absolute. She began to turn it slowly, a rhythmic, methodical rotation. 1, 2, 3. This was not a nervous habit. It was a calibration of her internal clock. Hestia knew that time was a tool, and Julian Vane was running out of it. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. Julian Vane did not walk into a room. He invaded it. He wore a neon-trimmed designer suit that screamed for attention. Behind him followed a fleet of assistants, each clutching a tablet as if it were a holy relic. Julian was the king of the digital age, a man who believed that algorithms could replace ancestors. He scanned the room with a look of bored contempt until his eyes landed on Hestia. He marched toward her, his expensive shoes clicking aggressively against the marble floor. He stopped only inches from her face, smelling of synthetic cologne and desperation. Hestia did not move. She did not blink. She simply continued to turn her sapphire ring. "You look beautiful tonight, Hestia," Julian said. His voice was too loud for the room. It was the voice of a man who used volume to hide his lack of depth. "It is a shame. This will be the last party these walls ever see." Hestia looked at him. Her eyes were piercing, calm. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen empires rise and fall while Julian was still learning to code. "Walls have a long memory, Julian," she replied. Her voice was a low, rich velvet that made his shout feel like a child's tantrum. "You should be careful what you say to them." Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore the heavy, red wax seal of the city's eminent domain office. He didn't offer it to her. He dropped it onto the small marble table beside her. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "That is the eviction notice," Julian whispered, his arrogance now a visible heat. "We break ground in 72 hours. Your ancestral home is in the way of the future. $50 million is in your account. Take the money, buy a penthouse in Dubai, and stay out of the way of progress." Hestia looked down at the envelope. She did not touch it. Instead, she looked back at Julian, her hand still rotating the sapphire. "Ring. Progress is a funny word, Julian. Most people use it to describe things they don't understand, like legacy or law." Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. He was not used to being lectured, especially by someone he considered a relic of a dead era. He reached for a glass of deep red vintage wine from a passing waiter's tray. He didn't drink it. He held it like a weapon. "You think you're special?" Julian hissed. He leaned in closer, his breath hot. "You're just a woman sitting on a pile of old dirt. I own the sky now. I own the data. And starting Monday, I own the ground you're standing on." Then he did it with a flick of his wrist. Julian tilted the glass. The dark, blood-red wine splashed across the front of Hestia's charcoal silk gown. It was a slow, deliberate insult. The liquid soaked into the delicate fabric, spreading like a wound. The ballroom went silent. The sound of 100 conversations died instantly. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of expensive wine hitting the marble floor. Julian's assistants chuckled nervously. Julian himself stood back, wearing a smirk that felt like a slap. "Oops," he said, the sarcasm dripping from his tongue. "It looks like you've lost your shine, Hestia. Just like this house. Just like your name." The crowd held its breath. They expected a scream. They expected tears. They expected Hestia Sterling to crumble under the weight of the humiliation. But Hestia did not flinch. She looked down at the red stain on her chest. Then she looked at the puddle on the floor. Her pulse remained steady. Her hands were as cold as the sapphire on her finger. She reached out, her fingers finally stopping the rotation of the ring. She picked up a white linen napkin from the table. She didn't wipe the dress. She simply blotted a single drop of wine from her hand. Then she looked at Julian Vane, and she smiled. It was not a smile of forgiveness. It was not a smile of shock. It was the smile of a predator watching a rabbit walk directly into a steel trap. It was a smile that reached her eyes, but did not warm them. "Thank you, Julian," she said. Her voice was perfectly clear, perfectly level. Julian's smirk wavered. His brow furrowed. "Thank you. For what?" "For confirming exactly who you are," Hestia replied. She stepped closer to him, moving into his personal space with a quiet, terrifying authority. "You see, Julian, you spent $10 billion building a city. You spent millions on lawyers to seize this land. You spent years dreaming of this moment." She paused, letting the silence stretch until Julian shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "But in your rush to be the king of the future, you forgot the first rule of the past. Never destroy something until you know what it's holding up." Julian felt a sudden, cold chill at the base of his spine. He tried to reclaim his bravado. "What is that supposed to mean?" "The law is on my side. The deed is signed. The house is coming down." Hestia leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "The house is just a shell. Julian, what's beneath it is what matters. You think you bought a plot of land, but what you actually bought is a sovereign easement. An easement that was written in 1876. An easement that I haven't signed over." She looked at the red wine on her dress one last time. "This silk gown cost $20,000, Hestia said, her smile widening just a fraction. "But the mistake you just made, Julian, is going to cost you everything you've ever built." She turned her back on him then, leaving him standing in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by the elite who were now whispering. Not about her dress, but about the look of pure, primal fear on Julian Vane's face. Hestia Sterling walked toward the grand staircase, her architectural silver bob gleaming under the lights. She didn't look back. She didn't need to dawdle as she reached the first step. She began to turn the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring again. 1, 2, 3. The game had officially begun. The sun rose over the Sterling estate with a cold, unforgiving clarity. It was a gray light, the kind of light that strips away the vanity of architecture and reveals the raw skeleton of history. 300 yards from the front gates, Julian Vane stood inside a mobile command center. It was a sleek, black trailer filled with flickering blue screens and the hum of high-end servers. He sipped an espresso that cost more than most people's hourly wage. His eyes were fixed on a 4K monitor, The screen showed a bird's-eye view. A drone was hovering 300 feet above the manor. To Julian, the Sterling home was not a landmark. It was an obstacle. It was a collection of limestone, wood, and memories that were getting in the way of his $10 billion data hub. He tapped a command on his tablet. Below him, the ground began to vibrate. 4 massive hydraulic excavators moved into position. They looked like prehistoric beasts, cold, yellow, and hungry. Julian felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the moment of disruption. This was where the old world finally bowed to the new, 5 miles away, in the penthouse of a hotel that Julian didn't know she owned. Hestia Sterling stood perfectly still. Her mahogany skin was flawless, polished. It caught the morning light like deep, dark glass. Her architectural silver bob was a sharp, symmetrical masterpiece that seemed to vibrate with its own inner logic. She was not watching the news. She was not looking at a drone feed. She didn't need to. She was wearing a charcoal cashmere robe. No logos, no distractions. Her hands were folded in front of her. On her pinky, the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring felt heavy, cold, and certain. She began to turn it. 1, 2, 3. She wasn't looking at the city's skyline. She was looking inward, into the deep, complex architecture of the trap she had set years ago back at the estate. The first excavator arm swung. The steel bucket slammed into the west parlor. The sound was not a crash. It was a structural scream, ancient oak, hand-carved by master craftsmen in the 19th century, splintered like dry bone. Dust erupted in a white, chalky cloud. Julian watched the screen and laughed. "Look at that," he muttered to his silent assistants. 100 years of history turned into trash in 3 seconds. That is the power of the future. He didn't notice the weight of the air change. He didn't see the way the drone's gimbal twitched as the first structural vibrations hit the earth. He was too busy watching the walls fall, the grand staircase, the library, the very floor where the wine had splashed onto Hestia's dress just 48 hours prior. It was all being pulverized into gray dust. Julian believed he was winning. He believed that by destroying the physical, he was erasing the legal. He was wrong. Deep beneath the manor, in a sub-basement that didn't appear on any modern digital scan, sat a room lined with lead. It was a space designed to survive a fire, a flood, or a siege. In the center of that room sat a heavy iron box. It was forged from cold-rolled steel and sealed with a wax that had not been manufactured since the Great Depression. Inside that box was not gold. It was not jewelry. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Julian Vane. It was the original sovereign deed of 1876, Hestia. Sterling turned her ring again. 4, 5, 6. She closed her eyes. She could feel the vibrations through the ground, even 5 miles away. Every time a heavy machine struck her home, she felt the click of a legal lock. In Tier 1 law, ownership is not about who has the keys. It is about who holds the sovereign easement. Julian Vane had bought the corporate rights. He had bought the municipal permits. He had even bought the corrupt judges. But he had never bought the land itself, because the land was not for sale. The Sterling estate was an anchor point. It was a rare legal anomaly known as a non-revertible sovereign trust. By the terms of the 1876 deed, the land could only be occupied if the primary residence remained standing. If the residence were to be destroyed by a third party, the entire plot, including everything built upon it, would instantly revert to the holder of the sovereign deed. Julian thought he was clearing the ground for his city. In reality, he was building his city on a foundation of legal quicksand. Every brick he laid, every server he installed, every dollar he spent from this moment forward is technically being gifted to Hestia Sterling. The excavators continued their work. The central chimney, a pillar of stone that had stood through 3 wars and 5 recessions, finally buckled. It fell with a sound like a thunderclap. The vibration was so intense, it cracked the screen on one of Julian's monitors. Julian didn't care. He was intoxicated by the destruction. He was a man who measured his worth by what he could break. He grabbed his phone and sent a text to his board of directors. The Sterling problem is gone. Ground is clear. We begin construction at noon. He stepped out of the trailer. The air outside was thick with the scent of pulverized limestone and old cedar. He took a deep breath, tasting the dust of Hestia's legacy. He felt like a king standing on a conquered battlefield. He looked down at the site, a flat gray scar on the earth. He didn't see the iron box. He didn't know that the structural failure of the chimney had triggered a seismic sensor inside that box. 5 miles away. A small, discreet light blinked on Hestia Sterling's desk. She opened her eyes. The silver of her hair seemed to catch the light of the morning sun. Her face remained a mask of calm, intellectual authority. She stopped turning the sapphire ring. She picked up a vintage fountain pen. The ink was a dark midnight blue, the same color as her ring. She signed a single document. It was a formal notice of immediate reversion. She didn't call the police. She didn't call the news. She called her lead litigation architect. The ground is clear, she said. Her voice was as smooth as silk, as sharp as a razor. Mr. Vane has completed the demolition for us. Free of charge, now we file the seizure. She hung up the phone. She walked over to her dressing table and picked up a small white porcelain cup. She poured herself a cup of Earl Grey tea. The steam rose in a slow, elegant spiral. She thought about Julian Vane, standing in the dirt, thinking he was a god. She thought about the $10 billion he was about to spend building her a new empire. Arrogance is a very expensive luxury, Julian, she whispered to the empty room. And you are about to pay the bill. She took a slow, measured sip of her tea. Her pulse was steady. Her mind was clear. The house was gone, but the sovereign move had just begun. Julian Vane was about to learn that you can bulldoze a house, but you cannot bulldoze a law, especially a law written by the woman who owns the ground you are standing on. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, a stark contrast to the roar of machinery 5 miles away. Hestia Sterling sat down in her leather chair, looking out over the city. She was the ghost in the machine, the silent architect of Julian's ruin, and she was just getting started. 24 hours is a lifetime in the world of high-stakes finance. For Julian Vane, it was supposed to be the victory lap of a century. The sun had set over the city, but the city did not grow dark. Instead, it glowed with a predatory, electric blue light, $10 billion of glass and silicon, pulsing with the rhythm of Julian's ego. From his penthouse command center, Julian looked down at the grid. His smart city was alive. Every server was humming. Every autonomous vehicle was gliding. Every citizen was a data point in his grand experiment. He felt like a god standing on a mountain of light. But Hestia Sterling was not a believer in gods. She believed in bylaws. 5 miles away, in the absolute silence of her private library, Hestia sat in a high-backed leather chair. The room smelled of old parchment, beeswax, and the cold scent of impending justice. She was wearing a midnight blue silk blouse that matched the deep, dark intensity of her sapphire ring. Her architectural silver bob caught the moonlight, creating a halo of cold metal around her mahogany face. She did not look at a screen. She looked at a vintage clock on the mantel, a clock that had been in her family since the Sterling Trust was first chartered. The hand ticked, a heavy, mechanical sound. Julian Vane was currently hosting a private celebration on the top floor of the Vane Tower. The champagne was flowing. The music was a low, thumping bass that mimicked a heartbeat. Julian was laughing, telling his investors how he had crushed the Sterling ghost. She thought she could stop progress with an old piece of paper. Julian mocked. He raised his glass to the window, to the glowing city below. Today, we proved that the future doesn't care about the past. He didn't notice the slight vibration in his glass. He didn't hear the high-pitched whine of the backup generators in the sub-basement. Hestia Sterling did. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the midnight blue sapphire. signet ring. She began to turn it. 1, 2, 3. In the world of sovereign law, there is a concept known as a negative easement. Most people understand that you can own the land, but few understand that you can also own the right to the light, the right to the air, and most importantly, the right to the flow of energy. When Julian Vane bulldozed the Sterling Manor, he didn't just destroy a house. He severed the physical anchor for the region's fiber optic trunk and high voltage transmission lines. Those lines were protected by a sovereign easement, a legal shield that stated the utility could only pass through that specific plot of land as long as the Sterling Manor stood as a guardian structure. By destroying the manor, Julian had legally revoked the city's right to use the power grid. Hestia picked up a heavy, silver-handled telephone. She didn't dial a number. She spoke into a direct line to the regional grid operator. "The guardian structure has fallen," she said. Her voice was a calm, deadly whisper. "Execute the reversion clause at exactly 12:01. The heart of the smart city stopped beating. It didn't happen all at once. First, the streetlights flickered and died, a wave of darkness rolling through the streets like a black tide. Then, the massive digital billboards, which had been screaming Julian's name to the sky, went silent. In the Vane Tower, Julian's champagne glass slipped from his hand. The music cut out. The air conditioning died. The hum of the servers, the very sound of his $10 billion dream, vanished. Julian ran to the window. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a shock that bordered on terror. The world's tech capital was now a tomb of glass. No servers, no lights, no security. What is happening? Julian screamed at his tech team. Why aren't the backups kicking in? One of his engineers looked up from a tablet. The screen was red with error codes, sir. It's not a technical failure. The grid operator has physically disconnected us. They are citing a breach of sovereign easement. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. Sovereign easement. What does that even mean? It means you are a squatter in the dark. Julian. The voice didn't come from the room. It came from the emergency intercom system, a system that Hestia Sterling had designed into the city's infrastructure years before. Julian ever broke ground. Hestia sat in her library, turning the sapphire ring. She could imagine Julian standing in his dark tower, surrounded by shadows. "You thought you could buy your way out of history," she said to the empty room. "But history is the only thing you can't pay off." The smart city was now a liability. Without power, the autonomous cars were stalled in the middle of the roads, blocking all traffic. Without servers, the biometric locks on the high-rise buildings had defaulted to permanent lockdown. Thousands of people were trapped in elevators, in offices, in homes. The world's tech capital was not just dark. It was paralyzed. Julian Vane grabbed a flashlight, its beam shaking in his hand. He looked out at his empire. It looked like a graveyard, a monument to a man who forgot to read the fine print. Hestia Sterling leaned back in her chair. The clock on the mantel continued to tick, each sound a reminder that Julian's fortune was draining away. Every minute the city stayed dark. Julian lost $50 million in liquidated damages in the dark. There is no algorithm in the dark. There is only the law. Hestia closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of the Sterling legacy settled around her, a heavy, protective cloak. She had lost her house, but she had gained the entire city. She stopped turning the ring. The sapphire felt warm against her skin now. The blackout was just the beginning. Julian had spent 24 hours celebrating his victory. Now he would spend the next 24 hours realizing that Hestia Sterling owned every inch of the darkness he was standing in. She picked up her porcelain cup of tea. It was still hot. She took a slow, measured sip. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens, the sound of a city in chaos, a city that Julian Vane had built, but a city that she now controlled. Fiduciary duty is a heavy burden, Julian, she whispered, and you have failed your investors. You have failed your city. And most importantly, you have failed me. The world was quiet. The world was dark. And Hestia Sterling was the only one who knew where the light switch was hidden. She set her cup down on the mahogany table. The sound was a sharp, final click. The trap had closed. The tech giant was in a cage of his own making, and the key was sitting in an iron box, deep beneath the ruins of a house that Julian Vane thought he had destroyed. He didn't realize that some things are more powerful when they are broken. 20. For hours is a lifetime in the world of high-stakes finance. For Julian Vane, it was supposed to be the victory lap of a century. The sun had set over the city, but the city did not grow dark. Instead, it glowed with a predatory electric blue light. $10 billion of glass and silicon, pulsing with the rhythm of Julian's ego. From his penthouse command center, Julian looked down at the grid. His smart city was alive. Every server was humming. Every autonomous vehicle was gliding. Every citizen was a data point in his grand experiment. He felt like a god standing on a mountain of light. But Hestia Sterling was not a believer in gods. She believed in bylaws. 5 miles away, in the absolute silence of her private library, Hestia sat in a high-backed leather chair. The room smelled of old parchment, beeswax, and the cold scent of impending justice. She was wearing a midnight-blue silk blouse that matched the deep, dark intensity of her sapphire ring. Her architectural silver bob caught the moonlight, creating a halo of cold metal around her mahogany face. She did not look at a screen. She looked at a vintage clock on the mantel, a clock that had been in her family since the Sterling Trust was first chartered. The hand ticked, a heavy, mechanical sound. Julian Vane was currently hosting a private celebration on the top floor of the Vane Tower. The champagne was flowing. The music was a low, thumping bass that mimicked a heartbeat. Julian was laughing, telling his investors how he had crushed the Sterling ghost. She thought she could stop progress with an old piece of paper. Julian mocked. He raised his glass to the window. To the glowing city below, today we proved that the future doesn't care about the past. He didn't notice the slight vibration in his glass. He didn't hear the high-pitched whine of the backup generators in the sub-basement. Hestia Sterling did. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring. She began to turn it. 1, 2, 3. In the world of sovereign law, there is a concept known as a negative easement. Most people understand that you can own the land, but few understand that you can also own the right to the light, the right to the air, and most importantly, the right to the flow of energy. When Julian Vane bulldozed the Sterling Manor, he didn't just destroy a house. He severed the physical anchor for the region's fiber optic trunk and high-voltage transmission lines. Those lines were protected by a sovereign easement, a legal shield that stated the utility could only pass through that specific plot of land as long as the Sterling Manor stood as a guardian structure. By destroying the manor, Julian had legally revoked the city's right to use the power grid. Hestia picked up a heavy, silver-handled telephone. She didn't dial a number. She spoke into a direct line to the regional grid operator. "The guardian structure has fallen," she said. Her voice was a calm, deadly whisper. "Execute the reversion clause. At exactly 12:01. The heart of the smart city stopped beating. It didn't happen all at once. First, the streetlights flickered and died, a wave of darkness rolling through the streets like a black tide. Then the massive digital billboards, which had been screaming Julian's name to the sky, went silent. In the Vane Tower, Julian's champagne glass slipped from his hand. The music cut out. The air conditioning died. The hum of the servers, the very sound of his $10 billion dream, vanished. Julian ran to the window. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a shock that bordered on terror. The world's tech capital was now a tomb of glass. No servers, no lights, no security. What is happening? Julian screamed at his tech team. Why aren't the backups kicking in? One of his engineers looked up from a tablet. The screen was red with error codes. Sir, it's not a technical failure. The grid operator has physically disconnected us. They are citing a breach of sovereign easement. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. Sovereign easement. What does that even mean? It means you are a squatter in the dark. Julian. The voice didn't come from the room. It came from the emergency intercom system, a system that Hestia Sterling had designed into the city's infrastructure years before. Julian ever broke ground. Hestia sat in her library, turning the sapphire ring. She could imagine Julian standing in his dark tower. Surrounded by shadows, you thought you could buy your way out of history, she said to the empty room. But history is the only thing you can't pay off. The smart city was now a liability. Without power, the autonomous cars were stalled in the middle of the roads, blocking all traffic. Without servers, the biometric locks on the high-rise buildings had defaulted to permanent lockdown. Thousands of people were trapped in elevators, in offices, in homes. The world's tech capital was not just dark. It was paralyzed. Julian Vane grabbed a flashlight, its beam shaking in his hand. He looked out at his empire. It looked like a graveyard, a monument to a man who forgot to read the fine print. Hestia Sterling leaned back in her chair. The clock on the mantel continued to tick, each sound a reminder that Julian's fortune was draining away. Every minute the city stayed dark. Julian lost $50 million in liquidated damages in the dark. There is no algorithm in the dark. There is only the law. Hestia closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of the Sterling legacy settled around her, a heavy, protective cloak. She had lost her house, but she had gained the entire city. She stopped turning the ring. The sapphire felt warm against her skin now. The blackout was just the beginning. Julian had spent 24 hours celebrating his victory. Now he would spend the next 24 hours realizing that Hestia Sterling owned every inch of the darkness he was standing in. She picked up her porcelain cup of tea. It was still hot. She took a slow, measured sip. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens, the sound of a city in chaos, a city that Julian Vane had built, but a city that she now controlled. Fiduciary duty is a heavy burden, Julian, she whispered, and you have failed your investors. You have failed your city. And most importantly, you have failed me. The world was quiet. The world was dark. And Hestia Sterling was the only one who knew where the light switch was hidden. She set her cup down on the mahogany table. The sound was a sharp, final click. The trap had closed. The tech giant was in a cage of his own making, and the key was sitting in an iron box, deep beneath the ruins of a house that Julian Vane thought he had destroyed. He didn't realize that some things are more powerful when they are broken. The air in the temporary headquarters of Vane Industries tasted like ozone, desperation, and the bitter, metallic temps of failing machinery. The room was illuminated only by the sickly orange glow of emergency chemical lanterns. Julian Vane stood in the center of the darkness. His neon-trimmed suit was now wrinkled, stained with the sweat of a man who had realized his digital fortress was built on a foundation of ghosts. His legal team, a group of the most expensive litigation minds in the country, sat around a table. Their faces were hollowed out by the shadows. In front of them sat a single physical folder. It was thick with yellowed parchment that smelled of dust and old iron. They had spent 12 hours trying to bypass the grid. They had spent millions on technicians who told them the same thing. The power isn't broken. It's been seized. Julian slammed his fist onto the mahogany table. The sound was dull, heavy, empty. Explain it to me, he hissed. His voice was cracked, stripped of its usual electronic confidence. How can a woman who hasn't worked a day in 20 years turn off $10 billion of infrastructure? The lead counsel, a man whose skin looked like dry paper, pushed a document across the table. His hand was shaking. It isn't about working, Julian. It is about the negative easement of 1876. Julian looked at the document. He didn't read it. He couldn't. The words were written in a dense, Victorian script that felt like a foreign language. "What is a negative easement?" Julian asked, his eyes darting to the window. To the pitch-black city that was once his monument. The lawyer cleared his throat. "It is a rare, institutional weapon. Most easements give you the right to do something, like run a pipe through land. But a negative easement gives the owner the right to prevent you from doing something. In this case, Hestia Sterling owns the right to the darkness." Julian's pulse jumped. He felt a cold, clammy sweat break out across his high cheekbones. The darkness. That's impossible. You can't own the absence of light. In the Sterling Trust, you can. The lawyer replied. The Sterling Manor was designated as a light anchor for the region. When you demolished it, you didn't just break the walls. You triggered a clause that prevents any artificial light or energy from occupying the space above that ground without the express written consent of the deed holder. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He realized that every server, every billboard, every light bulb in his smart city was currently a legal violation. "She isn't just turning off the power, Julian," the lawyer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She has exercised her right to keep the area in its natural state until you pay the trespass fees. 5 miles away, in the silent sanctuary of her penthouse, Hestia Sterling sat by a single tallow candle. The flame was steady, reflected in the glass skin finish of her deep mahogany face. Her architectural silver bob gleamed with a cold, lunar intensity. She looked like a statue carved from midnight and metal on her pinky finger. The Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring was cool against her skin. She began to turn it. 1, 2, 3. She wasn't thinking about Julian. She was thinking about fiduciary duty. She was thinking about the generations of Sterlings who had protected the ground beneath the sky. They had known that one day, a man like Julian Vane would come. A man who believed that the future could be bought with a swipe of a card. They had built a trap that didn't use locks. It used logic. Hestia leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking softly in the silence. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the city's darkness. It was a heavy, protective blanket. To Julian, the darkness was a tomb. To Hestia, it was home. In the dark war room, Julian was pacing. He looked like a caged animal, a man who had spent his life thinking he was the smartest person in the room, only to find out he wasn't even in the right room. "What are the trespass fees?" Julian asked, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. The lawyer looked down at a calculator. His face turned a shade of gray that matched the dust on the old deeds. $50 million. Per hour. Julian stopped pacing. He felt the floor beneath him tilt. 50 million. That's my entire cash reserve. In less than a day. The lawyer nodded. And because your assets are tied to the performance of the city, your stock has dropped 80% in the last 6 hours. The board of directors is already in emergency session. They are discussing your removal. Julian looked at the sapphire ring on Hestia's finger in his mind. He remembered the way she had smiled when he splashed the wine on her gown. He realized now that she wasn't smiling because she was brave. She was smiling because she had already won. The wine wasn't an insult to her. It was a signature on his own death warrant. Every drop of that wine was $1 he would never get back. Every brick of her house he destroyed was a nail in his own coffin. He looked at the emergency phone. He knew what he had to do. He had to beg. He had to crawl. He had to go to the woman he called a relic and ask for mercy. But Hestia Sterling did not deal in mercy. She dealt in reversion. She picked up her phone, her fingers brushing the sapphire ring. She didn't call Julian. She called the SEC. "I am filing a formal notification of asset seizure," she said. Her voice was a low, rhythmic melody. "Mr. Vane has defaulted on the sovereign easement. His company is no longer a going concern. It is a liability." She hung up the phone. She didn't feel joy. She felt the satisfaction of a master architect watching the final piece of a complex. Building click into place. Julian Vane thought he was building a city of the future. In reality, he was just building a very expensive monument to Hestia Sterling's patience. The darkness outside her window was absolute. It was a void that Julian's $10 billion could not fill. It was a void that only Hestia controlled. She picked up her porcelain cup. The tea was cold now, but she didn't mind. She liked the way the cold liquid felt against her throat. It was honest. It was sharp. Julian was currently running for his car. He was going to drive to her hotel. He was going to scream. He was going to threaten. He was going to do everything a small man does when he realizes he has been outplayed by a giant. He didn't know that his car wouldn't start. The biometric scanners were powered by the grid, and the grid belonged to Hestia. He was trapped in his own dark tower, surrounded by expensive glass that showed him nothing but his own terrified reflection. Hestia Sterling turned her ring one last time. 4, 5, 6. The game wasn't just over. It was being deleted. Julian Vane had spent his life trying to own the sky. He had forgotten to check who owned the ground. And now, the ground was reclaiming its own in the silence of the penthouse. Hestia smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had seen the end of the world and knew she would be the one to rebuild it. The darkness was her ally. The law was her weapon. And Julian Vane was her greatest creation. The air in the park was not just cold. It was indifferent. It was a gray, shivering morning that didn't care about Julian Vane's $10 billion loss. The mist hung low over the damp grass, smelling of wet earth, frozen asphalt, and the slow, rotting scent of autumn leaves. Julian Vane sat on a wooden bench. The wood was old, peeling, and soaked with a layer of frost that bit through his thin designer trousers. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His neon-trimmed suit was a mockery in this gray light. It was meant for glass offices and glowing screens. Out here in the raw, unfiltered world, it looked like a costume. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. But he couldn't stop the shaking. It wasn't just the cold. It was the realization that his entire digital empire was currently a dark, silent tomb. Hestia Sterling arrived at exactly 8 a.m. She did not come in a motorcade. She did not have assistance. She walked through the mist like a vision of absolute, quiet authority. Her custom-tailored navy wool coat was the color of a deep, midnight ocean. It had no logos, no hardware, just the perfect heavy drape of silk and wool. Her architectural silver bob was a sharp, symmetrical masterpiece that seemed to catch the pale light and sharpen it. Her mahogany skin was flawless, polished. It had a glass skin finish that made her look like she was carved from a single piece of dark, exotic wood. As she approached the bench, she didn't look at Julian. She looked at the horizon. She sat down on the far end of the freezing bench. She didn't flinch at the cold. She didn't adjust her coat. She simply sat, a statue of calm in the middle of Julian's chaos. She reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring on her pinky. It felt heavy. Certain, she began to turn it slowly. 1, 2, 3. Then she pulled out a vintage silver stopwatch. It was a heavy piece of mechanical history. It bore the Sterling family crest, an anchor wrapped in a serpent. She clicked the button. The sound was a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the empty park. "Hestia," Julian whispered. His voice was a ragged, desperate sound. "You have to stop this. The board is voting to remove me. My stock is at near zero. You've turned off the lights on $10 billion of progress." Hestia did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the ticking hand of the stopwatch. "You have 5 minutes, Julian," she said. Her voice was a low, rich velvet that cut through the cold air like a blade. "Use them wisely." Julian leaned forward, his breath coming out in white, frantic clouds. "I'll pay whatever the trespass fees are. I'll pay them. Just turn the grid back on. My lawyers say you're exercising a negative easement. Fine, you win. What is the number?" Hestia finally turned her head. Her gaze was piercing, cold. She looked at Julian the way an architect looks at a faulty blueprint. The number is irrelevant. Julian, she replied. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. You think this is a negotiation? You think you can write a check and erase the fact that you bulldozed a sovereign trust? Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. I offered you $50 million for that house. I offered you a way out. You offered me a bribe to ignore the law. Hestia corrected him. She looked down at the sapphire ring. The light reflected off the deep blue stone, casting a faint shadow across her mahogany skin. You didn't just break a house, Julian. You broke a fiduciary duty to the land. She clicked the stopwatch. 1 minute has passed. Julian felt the floor of his world drop another inch. He looked around the park, looking for an exit that didn't exist. Hestia, be reasonable. If my company fails, the city stays dark. Thousands of people lose their jobs. The economy will crater. Hestia Sterling smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had seen the rise and fall of 5 empires before Julian's father was born. The city will not stay dark, Julian. It will simply change hands. The Sterling Trust has already prepared the takeover bid. We aren't here to save your company. We are here to salvage the assets you've mismanaged. Julian stood up, his legs shaking, his arrogance trying to claw its way back to the surface. You can't do that. That's an illegal asset seizure. I'll fight you in every court in the country. Hestia looked up at him. She didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. You have 2 minutes left, Julian, she said. Her voice was an absolute, unbreakable weight. And while you are fighting in court, your creditors will be filing for foreclosure. Your investors will be filing for fraud. And your board will be testifying against you to save their own skins. She leaned in, the scent of sandalwood and expensive parchment drifting from her coat. You are currently standing on ground that has been in my family for 150 years. This park, this bench, even the air you are breathing, it is all part of the Sterling sovereign deed. She turned the ring again. 4, 5, 6. You came here thinking you could buy mercy, but mercy is for people who respect the rules. You chose to be a disruptor, Julian, so I disrupted you. Julian looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the razor-sharp cheekbones, the piercing, calm gaze. He saw a woman who didn't care about his algorithms, or his data hub, or his neon-trimmed suits. He saw the end of his life. What do you want? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Hestia Sterling clicked the stopwatch. Time is up. She stood up in one fluid motion. She didn't look cold. She didn't look tired. She looked like the ghost architect she was. The woman who wrote the bylaws that allowed titans to exist. And the woman who could delete them with a single signature. I want you to sit on this bench, Julian, Hestia said. She began to walk away, her boots clicking softly against the damp pavement. I want you to sit here in the cold and watch the sun come up over a city that no longer belongs to you. Hestia, Julian screamed after her. Don't do this. I'll give you anything. Hestia did not stop. She did not look back. You've already given me everything, Julian, she said, her voice drifting back through the mist. You just don't know it yet. She reached the edge of the park. A black, unbranded sedan was waiting for her. The door was opened by a driver who didn't say a word. As she stepped into the car, she looked at her midnight-blue sapphire signet ring one last time. The meeting was over. The billionaire was broken. And the sovereign move was entering its final, most destructive phase. Julian Vane sat back down on the frozen bench. He looked at his hands. They were blue from the cold. He looked at the city skyline. It was still dark, a graveyard of glass and steel. He was a titan who had been defeated by a woman with a stopwatch. He didn't know that while he was sitting there. Hestia Sterling's lawyers were already filing the paperwork to trigger the expired land lease clause, a clause that would transfer his entire smart city to the Sterling Trust for the price of $1. The sun began to rise, a thin, Pale line of light on the horizon dot, but for Julian Vane, the darkness was just beginning. Hestia Sterling leaned back in the soft, leather seat of her car. She pulled out a small, white porcelain cup of tea. It was still hot. She took a slow, measured sip. The trap was closed. The checkmate was inevitable. And the land beneath the sky was finally home. The silence between them was heavy. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the frozen wooden bench. Julian Vane looked at Hestia Sterling. He saw the way the pale morning light caught the sharp, symmetrical edge of her architectural silver bob. It looked like a blade of polished mercury. Her mahogany skin was a masterpiece of stillness, a glass skin finish that revealed nothing of the storm he was begging her to stop. Julian's phone vibrated in his pocket, a frantic, persistent buzzing that felt like a trapped insect. He ignored it. He couldn't look away from the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring on Hestia's pinky finger. She was turning it slowly. 1, 2, 3. Each rotation felt like a gear turning in a machine designed to grind him into dust. "I'll give you 100 million, Julian said. His voice was a thin, brittle sound that cracked in the cold air. 200 million. I'll buy back the easement at 5 times its market value. Just tell your lawyers to stand down." Hestia did not flinch. She did not even blink. She continued to look at the horizon where his dark city stood. "Like a graveyard dot, you still think this is about money, Julian?" she said. Her voice was a low, rich velvet. It was the sound of quiet luxury, the sound of a woman who didn't need to shout because she owned the silence. "You think you can treat the law like a subscription service that you can cancel when the price gets too high?" Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was a sound born of pure desperation. "Everything is about money, Hestia. That's how the world works. I built a $10 billion empire while you were sitting in your library reading old deeds. I am the future. You are just a shadow of a past that doesn't exist anymore." Hestia stopped turning the ring. She looked at him then. Her gaze was piercing, calm. It was the gaze of a predator that had already finished the hunt and was simply waiting for the prey to realize it was over. "The future requires a foundation, Julian," she replied. "You built a skyscraper on top of a lie. You treated fiduciary duty like a suggestion. You treated sovereign law like an obstacle. And now the bill has come due." She reached into her navy wool coat. She pulled out a single, folded piece of heavy cream parchment. It didn't have a corporate logo. It didn't have a digital watermark. It bore only the raised, red wax seal of the Sterling Trust. She laid it on the frost-covered bench between them. "This is the price," Hestia said. Her pulse was steady. Her hands were as cold and certain as the sapphire on her finger. Julian grabbed the paper. His fingers were blue from the cold. He tore it open, his eyes darting across the elegant, handwritten lines as he read. The color drained from his face. His jaw tightened until the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. "You're insane," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You want my resignation? Effective immediately. And a total transfer of the Vane Smart City assets into a nonprofit public trust." Hestia nodded. Her silver hair caught the light, stark, beautiful, and unforgiving. "The city was never yours to own, Julian. It was built on Sterling land. It was powered by Sterling infrastructure. You were merely the contractor. And your contract has been terminated for cause." Julian crumpled the paper in his fist. He stood up, towering over her, his shadow falling across her mahogany face. "I'll never sign this. I'll burn the city to the ground before I hand it over to a trust. I have investors. I have a board. They will fight you until every penny of the Sterling Trust is gone in legal fees." Hestia looked up at him. She didn't move. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she was observing a child having a tantrum in a museum. "Your board is currently meeting in a room without lights, Julian," she said. Her voice was a calm, deadly whisper. Your investors are watching their portfolios evaporate in real time. You think they are going to fight for a man who forgot to check who owned the ground beneath his feet?" She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle into the freezing. You are not a titan, Julian. You are a margin call waiting to happen at that exact moment." Julian's phone didn't just vibrate. It screamed, a high-pitched, digital alert that cut through the silence of the park. Like a siren, Julian's hand shook as he pulled the device from his pocket. The screen was bright, blinding in the gray morning. It was a notification from Global Prime Banking. Urgent margin call notice. Julian's eyes widened. He began to scroll, his thumb moving with a frantic slow. He made by a spasmodic energy. Asset value depreciation exceeds threshold. Loan to value. Ratio breached. Immediate liquidation of collateral commencing. The smart city was the collateral for his personal loans. Because the city was dark. Because the sovereign easement had been seized. The valuation of Vane Industries had hit zero in the eyes of the bank's risk algorithm. He had used his shares to fund his lifestyle, to buy the neon suits, to buy the drones, to buy the $50 million bribe he tried to give Hestia, and now the bank was taking them back. Julian felt the air leave his lungs. He slumped back onto the bench. The wood creaked under his weight. He looked at the phone as if it were a bomb that had just detonated in his hands. "The margin call is for $3 billion, Julian whispered. His voice was hollow. "I don't have $3 billion in cash. Everything is tied up in the infrastructure." Hestia leaned in. The scent of sandalwood and expensive parchment drifted toward him. She reached out and touched the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring. "I know," she said. "I bought your debt 3 hours ago." Julian looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a primal, terrified realization. You're the bank. The Sterling Trust doesn't just own land." Julian Hestia replied. "We own the debt that allows people like you to dream. I didn't just seize your city. I seized your life." She stood up. She looked down at him. A man sitting on a frozen bench, clinging to a phone that was telling him he was a ghost. "The resignation is on the bench," Hestia said. Her architectural silver bob gleamed with a final, metallic light. "You have 60 seconds to sign it. If you do, I will satisfy the margin call and allow you to walk away with your personal estate. If you don't, I will execute the liquidation." She clicked the silver stopwatch. The sound was a sharp, final snap. 60 seconds. "Julian, make it count." Julian Vane looked at the paper. He looked at the woman with the mahogany skin and the silver hair. He realized he was looking at the architect of his ruin, a woman who had played a game of chess while he was playing with blocks. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the dark city toward them. It was the scent of cold glass and silent servers. Julian reached for the fountain pen Hestia held out. His hand was trembling so hard he could barely grip the gold barrel. He signed. The ink was a deep midnight blue, the same color as her ring, the same color as the darkness he had tried to conquer. Hestia picked up the paper. She didn't look at the signature. She knew it was there. She knew the machine had finished its work. She turned her sapphire ring one last time. 4, 5, 6. "The smart city is no longer yours, Julian," she said. Her voice was an absolute, unbreakable weight. "It belongs to the people now, protected by a trust that you can never touch." She began to walk away, her navy coat flowing behind her like a royal cape. "Hestia," Julian called out. His voice was small, lost in the mist. "Why? Why did you do all of this? Was it really just for the house?" Hestia stopped. She didn't turn around. "It was for the principal, Julian," she replied. "You splashed wine on a Sterling? You should have checked the vintage before you made your move." She stepped into her waiting sedan. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud. Julian Vane sat on the bench. He was alone. He was cold, and he was penniless. He looked at his phone. The screen was black. The power was gone, and for the first time in his life, He understood the value of the darkness. The atmosphere inside the Vane Industries war room felt like a sinking submarine. The air was heavy with the scent of hot copper and the sharp, synthetic ozone of overworked servers. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the smart city was a dark, silent graveyard of glass. $10 billion of ambition, frozen by a single piece of parchment. Julian Vane stood in front of a massive digital ticker. The numbers were no longer white. They were a violent, pulsing red. Every flick of the screen was a heartbeat of his empire dying. The stock price was not just falling. It was undergoing a total structural collapse. $600 a share. 500. 350. Each drop represented $1 billion in market capitalization, vanishing into the digital void. Julian's high cheekbones were hollowed out by the red light. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He looked like a man watching his own execution in high definition 5 miles away. In the absolute stillness of her private conservatory, Hestia Sterling sat in a chair of hand-stitched ebony leather. The room smelled of rain, rare white tea, and the cold, clean scent of antique silver. The temperature was a constant. Disciplined 68 degrees. Hestia was the image of absolute, sovereign authority. Her mahogany skin had a glass skin finish that caught the dim light of the morning. Her architectural silver bob was a sharp, symmetrical masterpiece that didn't have a single hair out of place. She was wearing a custom-tailored, charcoal silk dress that moved like liquid smoke. On her pinky finger, the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring felt heavy, cold, absolute. She began to turn it. Slowly, 1, 2, 3. Her internal monologue was not one of anger. It was one of pure accure, mathematical precision. She was not seeking revenge. She was seeking a correction. Julian Vane was an error in the ledger of the elite, and errors must be liquidated. Hestia knew that the algorithm governing the global stock exchange was a creature of habit. It thrived on activity. It feasted on growth. But when a $10 billion asset goes inactive, the algorithm reacts with a predatory instinct. It sees a void, and it moves to fill it with fire. Back in the dark tower, Julian's phone was vibrating so violently it danced across the glass table. It wasn't one call. It was a symphony of betrayal. The names on the screen were the very people who had toasted his success only 48 hours ago. The board of directors, the institutional investors, the venture capitalists. Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too hard to swipe the glass. He watched as the ticker hit $100, a 90% plummet in 60 minutes. This was not a market correction. This was a surgical asset seizure performed by the ghost of the past. The board was not calling to save him. They were calling to offer him up as a sacrifice. Hestia Sterling picked up her own phone. It was a heavy, bespoke device with a single, encrypted line. The screen didn't show a number. It showed the seal of the Sterling Trust. "Yes," she said. Her voice was a low, rich velvet that carried the weight of centuries. On the other end, the chairman of the board for Vane Industries spoke with a voice that was thin and brittle. "Hestia, we have seen the filing. We have seen the sovereign easement. We are prepared to strip Julian Vane of his chairmanship and his voting rights effective immediately." Hestia turned her sapphire ring. 456. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch. She let the chairman feel the cold weight of the Sterling legacy pressing against his throat. Silence was her primary weapon. It forced the arrogant to fill the air with their own weakness. "The city is dark," Hestia said finally, "and darkness is an expensive commodity." The chairman's breathing was audible, heavy with fear. "We understand. We are prepared to transfer the infrastructure to the Sterling Trust for a symbolic $1. We only ask that the power be restored before the margin calls trigger." A total global contagion. Hestia looked out at the dark horizon. She could see the Vane Tower, a black needle piercing the gray clouds. "Liquidation is a necessary process for growth," she replied. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. "I will accept the transfer. But Julian Vane must not just be removed. He must be erased from the record." She hung up. The click of the phone was a final, sharp sound that signaled the end of an era in the war room. Julian Vane had collapsed into his leather chair. The very chair Hestia had sat in during his flash-forward nightmare. He felt the cold air of the blackout seeping through the vents. The backup batteries were dying. The screens were flickering. The digital world was leaving him behind. He realized then that he had made the fatal mistake of the new money elite. He thought that because he had the data, he had the power. He didn't understand that the data was just a layer of paint on a house owned by Hestia Sterling. He had bulldozed her manor, and in doing so, he had bulldozed the only thing that gave his company a legal right to exist. The Sterling Manor wasn't just a house. It was a fiduciary anchor, a sovereign deed that stated the land's utility was tied to the presence of the Sterling bloodline. By destroying the walls, he had triggered a total reversion clause. The land, the fiber optics, the power grid, and every server he had installed had legally reverted to the Sterling Trust. The moment the first brick hit the ground, the 90% stock plummet was just the market acknowledging the truth. Julian Vane owned nothing. He was a squatter in a $10 billion suit. Julian looked at the Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring in his mind. He remembered the way Hestia had turned it while he splashed wine on her dress. He realized now that she wasn't counting the seconds. She was counting his sins. A notification pinged on his personal tablet. It was the final nail. Notice of foreclosure. All personal assets seized. His penthouse, his private jet, his collection of rare watches, even the designer suit he was wearing. It was all tied to the valuation of his stock, and the stock was gone. The world's tech capital was now a tomb, and Julian was the only one left inside it. Hestia Sterling stood up from her chair. She walked to the window of her conservatory. The rain was beginning to fall, a soft, gray curtain that washed the city clean. She touched the sapphire ring. One last time, the liquidation was complete. The error had been corrected. The Sterling Trust was now the sole owner of the infrastructure of the future. She didn't feel pride. She felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that comes from a job perfectly executed. Julian Vane wanted to build a city of the future. Hestia Sterling had simply reminded him that the future is built on the bones of the past. She picked up a white porcelain cup. The tea was still hot. She took a slow, measured sip. The board of directors was already sending the digital keys to her office. Within the hour, the Sterling Trust would energize the grid. The lights would come back on. The servers would hum, but they would hum for her. Hestia looked at her reflection in the glass. The mahogany of her skin, the silver of her hair, the blue of her ring. She was the invisible architect, the woman who didn't run the world, but wrote the code that allowed it to function. Julian Vane was a memory, a cautionary tale for the next man who thought he could run his debt to the ground. The sun began to break through the clouds. A single sharp beam of light that hit the Vane Tower. Hestia Sterling watched the light. Her eyes were piercing, calm, absolute. The sovereign move was over. The land beneath the sky was hers. The penthouse office of the Vane Tower was no longer a monument to the future. It was a cold, hollow shell of a dead dream. The floor-to-ceiling windows, once pulsing with the neon data of a $10 billion city, were now dark mirrors reflecting only the flickering orange light of a single emergency chemical lantern. Outside, the world was silent. The city of the future had become a graveyard of glass because of the blackout, because of the seizure, because Hestia Sterling had decided that Julian Vane's time was up. Julian sat at his massive, polished obsidian desk. He looked small. His neon-trimmed suit was wrinkled. His hair, once perfectly styled, was a messy, sweat-soaked disaster. His eyes were bloodshot, darting between the legal documents on the desk and the shadow standing by the window. Hestia Sterling, did not need a chair to command the room. She stood perfectly still, her navy wool coat draped over her shoulders like a royal mantle. Her mahogany skin caught the dim orange light, a smooth, glass skin finish that revealed no emotion, no pity. Her architectural silver bob was a sharp, symmetrical masterpiece that seemed to absorb the shadows on her pinky finger. The Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring was a cold, heavy anchor. She began to turn it slowly. 1, 2, 3. In the world of the elite, time is not measured in seconds. It is measured in consequences. Julian was currently facing 40 years of federal prison for institutional fraud, negligence, and the total collapse of the region's critical infrastructure. Hestia had ensured the charges were absolute. She didn't just sue him. She dismantled his legal standing by proving he had violated his fiduciary duty to the city's board. Sign the papers, Julian, Hestia said. Her voice was a low, rich velvet that carried the weight of a death sentence. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. Julian looked at the pen in his hand. It was a heavy, gold-plated instrument. To him, it felt like a lead weight. If I sign this, I lose everything, he whispered. His voice was a ragged, trembling sound. The company, the patents, the city. I'll have nothing left but my name. Hestia looked at him then. Her gaze was piercing, calm. It was the gaze of a woman who had seen the rise and fall of 5 empires before Julian's father was born. If you don't sign, you lose your freedom. She replied, your name is already a liability. In 1 hour, the district attorney will file the warrant. By the time the sun rises, you will be a prisoner of the state. She paused, letting the silence stretch until the ticking of the clock on the wall felt like a hammer hitting a nail. Sign the transfer of all Vane Industries assets to the Sterling Sovereign Trust, Hestia continued, her voice an unbreakable weight. In return, I will satisfy the margin call. I will withdraw the criminal complaints. And I will allow you to walk out of this building with your dignity, such as it is. Julian's hand shook violently. He looked at the signature line. It was the end of his life as a titan. It was the moment he admitted that the new money algorithm had been defeated by the old money law. He looked at Hestia. Why? Why did you do all of this? Was it really just because I bulldozed that old house? Hestia stopped turning the sapphire ring. She moved toward the desk, her boots clicking softly against the marble floor. She leaned in, the scent of sandalwood and expensive parchment drifting from her coat. The house was a symbol, Julian, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly, private whisper. But the land beneath it was a sovereign deed. You thought you could bypass the past. You thought you could treat 150 years of inheritance law like a software update. She looked down at the documents. You didn't just destroy my home. You triggered a negative easement. An easement that stated the utility rights of this entire city were tied to the physical structure of the Sterling Manor by breaking the walls. You broke your own future. Julian let out a sharp, sobbing breath. He lowered the pen. The gold tip scratched against the parchment as he scribbled his name. The signature was a messy, desperate scrawl, a graphic representation of a man's total collapse. He pushed the papers toward her. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. There, it's done. You have the city. You have the company now. Give me the mercy you promised. Hestia picked up the papers. She didn't look at the signature. She knew the machine had finished its work. She didn't leave the room. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, heavy item. It was a black iron box, forged from cold-rolled steel. Its surface was scarred by the weight of a century and the fresh scratches of the bulldozers that had unearthed it. From the ruins of her home, Hestia set the box on the obsidian desk. Julian looked at it, his brow furrowed in confusion. What is that? This is the iron box you missed, Julian, Hestia said. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sapphire ring on her pinky. She turned it one last time. 4, 5, 6. She pulled a small, rusted key from her pocket. She inserted it into the lock of the box. The sound was a sharp, heavy click. She opened the lid. Inside, there was no gold. There were no jewels. There was only a single, rolled sheet of vellum. It bore the heavy, dark seal of the Maritime Sovereignty Commission of 1892. Julian leaned in, his eyes darting across the faded text. "What does it say?" "It is the final secret," Julian Hestia replied. Her silver hair caught the dim light, stark, beautiful, and unforgiving. "Most people think a deed gives you ownership of the land, but this is a sovereign deed of air." Julian felt a sudden, cold chill at the base of his spine. A deed of air. Hestia nodded. According to the maritime protocols of this region, the Sterling Trust does not just own the ground. We own the rights to the space above it, every inch of sky your towers occupy, every cubic meter of air your servers breathe. She looked at him. Her smile was not one of forgiveness. It was the smile of a predator watching a rabbit walk directly into a steel trap. The land lease you thought you had. It only applied to the surface. But the Sterling Trust never sold the rights to the atmosphere. Hestia leaned back, her pulse steady, her mind clear. This means that every skyscraper you built, every satellite you launched, every digital signal you transmitted, was a trespass on Sterling property. You weren't just a squatter on the ground, Julian. You were a squatter in the sky. Julian felt the floor of his world drop another inch. He realized that even if he had won the court case for the ground, he would have lost the war for the air. The iron box was his true death warrant. "You knew," Julian whispered, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. "You knew I would build the towers. You knew I would spend $10 billion before I realized I didn't own the sky." Hestia picked up the vellum. She rolled it up carefully, placing it back into the iron box. "Fiduciary duty is a heavy burden, Julian," she said. She began to walk away, her navy coat flowing behind her like a royal cape. As she reached the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. "You spent your life trying to dominate the future, but you forgot that the past is the one who writes the bill." She walked out of the office, leaving Julian Vane sitting in the dark, surrounded by the cold glass of an empire that he never truly owned. The sun began to break through the clouds. A single, sharp beam of light that hit the Vane Tower. For Julian Vane, the darkness was absolute. Hestia Sterling stepped into her waiting sedan. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud. She looked at her Midnight-Blue Sapphire Signet Ring. The sovereign move was over. The land beneath the sky was hers, and the air belonged to the Matriarch. The dawn did not break the darkness. It merely revealed the wreckage that Julian Vane called an empire. The emergency chemical lantern in the center of the obsidian desk was sputtering, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the mahogany skin of Hestia Sterling. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the silent city. To the world, this was a tragedy of infrastructure. To Hestia, it was a long overdue audit. Her architectural silver bob was a sharp, symmetrical masterpiece that seemed to hold the cold light of the morning. She was the ghost architect, the woman who understood that power is not about what you build. It is about what you allow to exist. Her charcoal silk dress was silent as she moved. A shadow within a shadow. Julian Vane sat in the executive chair. He was the man who had splashed wine on a legend. Now he was the man who owned nothing but the air in his lungs. And even that, he was starting to realize, might have a lien against it. He looked at the heavy, black iron box sitting on his desk. It was an object of pure, physical weight. It didn't belong in a room filled with fiber optics and cloud servers. It was a relic. Much like the woman who brought it, Hestia turned away from the window. She moved with a slow, disciplined grace that made the heartbeat of the room seem to slow down. She reached out, her fingers brushing the midnight-blue sapphire signet ring on her pinky finger. She began to turn it. 1, 2, 3. The sapphire caught the orange flicker of the lantern. Deep, dark, and absolute. You think you signed a surrender? Julian, Hestia said. Her voice was a low, rich velvet. It was a sound that carried the authority of 1,000 years of law. You think you traded your company for your freedom? Julian looked up. His eyes were hollow. I signed the transfer. The smart city belongs to the Sterling Trust. What else is there? I am bankrupt. My reputation is a smoking crater. I am a squatter in a suit. Just like you said, Hestia stopped turning the ring. She leaned over the desk. Her razor-sharp cheekbones were illuminated by the dying light of the lantern. You are not just a squatter on the ground, Julian, she whispered. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. You are a squatter in the sky. She reached into her coat and pulled out the small, rusted key. She didn't look at the box as she inserted the key. She looked at Julian. She wanted to see the moment the logic hit him. She wanted to see the exact second his digital mind realized it had been defeated by ink and vellum. The click of the lock was a heavy, final sound. Hestia opened the lid. Inside sat a single document. It was not on modern paper. It was on thick, hand-pressed vellum that had survived the weight of the Sterling Manor. It bore the heavy, dark seal of the Maritime Sovereignty Commission of 1876, an era when men understood that land was only one dimension of ownership. Julian reached for the paper. His fingers were trembling. He was a man who lived in the cloud, but he was about to be destroyed by the air. This is the original deed of heir, Hestia said, her voice an unbreakable weight. In 1876, my ancestors didn't just buy the ground. They bought the superjacent airspace. They bought the right to every cubic inch of sky from the dirt to the stars. Julian's brow furrowed. He began to read the dense Victorian script. His eyes darted across words like avigation rights, negative vertical easement, and use your fructuary airspace. I don't understand, Julian muttered, his voice cracking. This is about flight paths. This is about birds. Hestia smiled. It was the smile of a predator watching a rabbit walk directly into a steel trap. It is about sovereignty, Julian, she replied. When you bought the permits to build your smart city, you bought them from the municipality. You bought the ground rights. But the municipality never owned the air. The Sterling Trust never ceded the vertical rights. She leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood and expensive parchment drifting from her coat. Every floor of this tower, above the 3rd story, is a trespass. Every wireless signal you transmitted through this airspace was an unauthorized intrusion into Sterling property. You didn't just build a city. You built an illegal encroachment. Julian felt the floor beneath him tilt. He looked up at the high ceiling. Then out at the skyline. He realized the scale of the trap. It wasn't just this building. It was the entire city. You knew. Julian whispered. You watched me spend $10 billion building towers in the sky, knowing I didn't own the space they occupied? Hestia straightened up. She began to turn the sapphire ring again. 4, 5, 6. I didn't watch you, Julian. I calculated you. She said, you were so obsessed with the speed of your growth that you never checked the friction of the law. You treated the ground like a commodity. But to a Sterling, the ground is a covenant. She moved back toward the window. The sun was finally rising. A sharp, cold line of light that hit the glass skin finish of her face. You thought you could bulldoze the past. Hestia continued, her voice a low, rhythmic melody. You thought that because my house was old, my power was gone. But you forgot that the older the law, the deeper its roots. Julian looked at the deed of heir. He realized the checkmate logic. If Hestia owned the air, she didn't just own the buildings. She owned the right to demolish them. She could declare his entire $10 billion hub a public nuisance. She could force the demolition of every structure that rose more than 30 feet off the ground. It was a total, systemic liquidation. The board of directors didn't just call me because the lights went out, Julian, Hestia said. They called me because their legal teams found this deed in the public archives 3 hours ago. They realized that Vane Industries has been operating in a state of permanent trespass for 5 years. The liability alone is enough to bankrupted every bank that funded you. Julian slumped back in the chair. He looked like a man who had been erased. He was the king of the future. But he was a king without a kingdom. He was a ghost in a machine that Hestia Sterling had just unplugged. The city is dark, Julian, and it will stay dark until I decide who is worthy of the light. Hestia said. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She picked up the iron box. The weight of it was comforting, a physical reminder of the discipline of her ancestors. She walked toward the door, her boots clicking against the marble floor, a sound of finality as she reached the exit. She stopped. She looked at her midnight-blue sapphire signet ring. Julian, she said. He didn't look up. He was staring at the wine stain on the carpet, the stain from the glass he had smashed in his arrogance. Next time you try to disrupt the world, Hestia said, her voice a low, deadly whisper, make sure you aren't standing in the middle of a trap that was set before your grandfather was born. She walked out, the heavy oak doors closing with a soft, expensive thud. Outside, the sedan was waiting. The driver held the door open in total silence. Hestia stepped inside. The leather was cool. The air was clean. She sat back and looked at the silver bob reflected in the darkened glass. She reached for a small, white porcelain cup of tea. It was still hot. She took a slow, measured sip. The city was waking up. People were walking through the dark streets, wondering when the lights would come back on. They didn't know that their entire world had just changed hands. They didn't know that the invisible architect had returned to claim her throne. Hestia Sterling turned her ring one last time. 7, 8, 9. The sovereign move was complete. The land beneath the sky was hers, and the sky itself was now under management. The matriarch's will had been done. Julian Vane sat in his dark office, watching the sun hit the top of a tower he didn't own. In a city that didn't want him, he was a squatter in a suit, waiting for a future that Hestia Sterling had already deleted. The darkness was not an ending. It was a new beginning, and the new world would be built on Sterling terms. Hestia closed her eyes. The car moved silently through the city. She was the ghost in the machine, the silent hand on the tiller of the global economy. She was Hestia Sterling, and the game was finally over.